Well, good morning. My name is Pete Griffin, and I have lived and worked in Alaska for the last 26 years. I started out my career with the U.S. Forest Service as a wildlife biologist, eventually became a ranger here in Alaska, and once my family and I got to Alaska, we never left. One of the things that I've been curious about is that there are a number of folks who have moved to Alaska for various reasons. Most have a job lined up. A job in the oil industry or the fishing industry, the tourism industry, some are in mining. A whole host of folks have moved here for those specific jobs. But I've always been interested in people who move to Alaska just, it seems like on a whim, without a job lined up or anything else. And over the course of 26 years, I've kept careful track of those people that I've talked to and why they moved to Alaska without a job. And the top three reasons are, number three is that they're in the witness protection program. Big state, it's easy to hide. Now, the second top reason for moving to Alaska without a job prospect is that you're running from the law in the lower 48. I read the police blotters in the local papers all the time, and it never fails. Every week, somebody gets stopped because they have a tail light out or they exceeded the speed limit. And lo and behold, there is a warrant for their arrest in some state in the lower 48. Just why you would drive around without a tail light out is beyond me if you're running from the law. But the top reason folks move to Alaska without a job is that they have fallen in love with the idea of living off the land. Go to Alaska hunting and fishing and trapping. Boy, I'll just make my living. I'll build a little cabin out in the woods. Most of these guys aren't married. But living off the land, it's a little more complex than just going out hunting and fishing and shooting and trapping. It doesn't always work out. You might remember this 1996 book by John Krakauer, Into the Wild. It's about a young man, Christopher McCandless, who at the age of 22 sold all his belongings, gave away his savings account, and went to the interior of Alaska with a .22 rifle, a case of shells, 10 pounds of rice, and he was going to live off the land. 119 days later, he had died. Now, there's some speculation as to why he had died. Some say that he had starved to death. There are some that say that he ate some poison berries or poison roots and therefore passed away. And there are other folks that said, well, his food supply got infected with a fungus of some sort that created a toxin that resulted in his death. And it's still under debate. You might remember there was a 2006 film by Sean Penn by the same name about young Christopher. So it's more than simply hunting and fishing and gathering berries. Living off the land, you have to have a tradition for doing that. You need to be from a culture that does that, or you have to have family that has done that to pass on the lessons about living off the land. And I have some stories to illustrate this in particular. When I was growing up in the woods of Upper Michigan, when I was out with my grandparents or my parents or my aunts and uncles, every once in a while I would point out a berry. It looked big and fat and juicy. Oh, is that good to eat? And on this particular berry, they said, oh no, that's snakeberry. They're poisonous. You don't eat them. You don't taste them. You don't even touch them, because there's a kid from up the road, probably in Dafter, that ate a bunch of snakeberries, had to be taken to the hospital to have his stomach pumped. Now, I'd never been to a hospital. I'd never had my stomach pumped, but it was something that I did not want to experience. So for years, I learned that snakeberries were inedible. Well, I also learned that whenever I pointed out a berry that I didn't know what it was, and my elders didn't know what it was, the quick and easy answer was, no, that's a snakeberry. It's poisonous. You don't eat them, you don't taste them, you don't even touch them. Well, a few years back, I was standing on my porch in Juneau, Alaska, and I looked down and I saw this plant that I recognized as being a snakeberry from my youth. Well, now after having several courses in wildlife ecology or botany and plant ecology, I recognized that that was not a snakeberry. So I looked it up in my book, and it turns out this was a twisted stalk, and it's also called watermelon berry, and lo and behold, watermelon berries were good to eat. So I jumped off the porch. I took a risk. I plucked one of these berries off the plant. It was bigger and more purple than this. It was really ripe. I popped it in my mouth, took a bite, and my mouth was flooded with the taste of watermelon. Watermelon. I had been missing out on this berry for over 60 years. Now, my book did go on to say that there's also another common name for it called scootberry, because if you ate too many, you would develop a condition in which you would not want to be too far away from a bathroom that you would scoot off to. Now, my research consists of Googling stuff on the internet. Also, I found that this berry is considered poisonous by many tribes in the interior of Alaska, and they call it dead man's berry. And I gotta believe that somewhere along the Yukon River, a grandfather and his grandson are walking along the banks of the Yukon River, and the young man says, "Grandfather, look at that berry. It's big and plump and juicy. Is that good to eat?" "Oh no, that's dead man's berry." There's a young man up from Eagle River, up the river there, that ate a bunch of dead man's berries, had to be airlifted to Fairbanks to have his stomach pumped. So that is one of the ways we pass on information from generation to generation. It isn't always true, but I'll tell you what, because of what they passed on to me, I never ate any berry that I did not know what it was. So in a way, they probably saved my life. Now, in my arrogance, I told this story over and over, and folks always got a chuckle, but I did find that there is a plant, and it grows in Alaska. It grows in upper Michigan. That is baneberry, and one of the local names for it is snakeberry, and it is one of the poisonous berries that you do not want to eat. So living off the land. Fishing is an important part of living off the land. In fact, fish make up, I think, most of the diet of people, of rural Alaskans who live off the land. And I have a story about Sweetheart Creek. Sweetheart Creek is a creek about 70 miles south of Juneau. It's accessible only by boat. It has a run of sockeye salmon. And the salmon run up this short creek, and they run into a barrier falls, that the fish cannot jump over to go up above and spawn. So they collect there at the base of the falls. And this is a short video of the falls itself. You'll notice the sockeye salmon are not going to make it up. So anywhere there's a place where fish collect is a good place to fish. And a good place for humans to fish is a good place for bears to fish. You notice that this brown bear, standing on a rock, waiting for sockeye salmon to come by. The fisherman's boat is here in the foreground, and you'll notice a couple of fishermen down the stream there debating on how to get back to their boat. So this is a couple of years ago, I wrangled an invitation from my son-in-law to go fishing down at Sweetheart Creek for sockeye salmon. Primarily, I wanted to get some bear photographs, and I wasn't disappointed. This is a young brown bear, and you can tell he's young by how long his legs are and how long his ears are. This is a feature of young bears. As they get older, their legs appear to get shorter, their ears appear to get shorter. What it is that their legs don't actually get shorter, but the bear's abdomen gets lots bigger, and hangs lower to the ground so his legs look shorter and his head fills out so it looks like he has very stubby little ears. But this is a place where teenage bears hang out. They're young bears, 2-3 years old after they've left their mother, and like teenagers anywhere, they're pushing the boundaries, trying the patience of anybody who is around them. So the fishermen at Sweetheart Creek and the bears at Sweetheart Creek kind of have a set of protocols they operate by. The fishermen never leave their fish unattended so that the bears can get them. And the fishermen will never drop their fish if a bear approaches them and then back away, because all that does is teach the bear that all they have to do is bluff these people. They'll drop their fish. I get a free fish meal. So that's one set of the protocols. Now we go down there and we cast net for sockeye salmon. I had never seen cast netting in operation before, but this is my second cast. He had a nice haul of 4 or 5 sockeye salmon in that set. Now, this is a favorite spot for folks that are fishing for sockeyes. You can throw your cast net upstream, you can throw it downstream and from this little cleft in the rock, but it's also a good lookout spot for bears. You might notice that this bear, it also has long ears, so it is a teenage bear looking for fish, and it's a little disconcerting the first time it happens to you that you have a bear 20 feet away from you watching. And this one's got a real interest in what Jake is doing. So when I was with Jake, Jake was doing the fishing and I was down there in the rock cleft with him. I was armed with an air horn. Jake actually had like a 44 Ruger sidearm just in case, but I didn't want to carry that kind of weight. And for the most part, an air horn is enough to make the bear uncomfortable enough to back off. So we were fishing, and we noticed fishermen on the other side of the stream, and they started pointing in our direction, pointing at the bank, and I knew what that meant. There was a bear probably heading in our direction. And sure enough, this bear wanders over to this little rocky cliff, and that cliff is probably, oh gosh, it might be 10, 12 feet high, and the cleft we're fishing in is probably 6 to 8 feet wide. And so this bear decides he's going to poke his head over and take a look and see what he can see. I posted this on Facebook, and one of my friends back east said, "You didn't take that with a cell phone, did you?" No, I did not take that with a cell phone, but you look at the expression on that bear's face, and I always, in the audience, I say, well, you know, what is this bear thinking of? Well, oh gosh, I think on one of my last trips, there was a woman from Tennessee came up to me after the presentation. She said, "I know exactly what that bear was thinking. It was thinking, is that juice worth the squeeze?" Apparently, we were not worth the squeeze because the bear eventually moved on. But one of the things that the bears have learned, if they can't get the fish from the fishermen, we always take care of, we do our gutting of the fish, removing the innards and the gills in fresh water, in running water. Now, I grew up in the Midwest where if you cleaned your fish and you threw your fish guts off in the stream or in the lake, people would be upset with you. But here in Alaska, when you process your fish, you are required to dispose of the fish entrails in fast-moving water. And so we do that so we don't have an accumulation of fish innards on the shore stinking and attracting even more bears. But what the bears have learned is that downstream of these places where we clean our fish, they can pick up milt in row sacks just for picking them up out of the water. And I want you to notice one of the things here. This bear is in this stream where it's quite loud. He's walking up the stream, just minding his own business. When that happens, there was someone on the trail. And that is one of the things that you really want to avoid. You want to avoid taking bears by surprise. That's why people wear bear bells, or they make noise, especially on a loud river like this, where your approach might be camouflaged by the noise from the water. Because the last thing you want to do is come around the bend and you and Mr. Brown Bear are only 5 to 10 feet apart, because the brown bear's first inclination is, you're a problem, I'm going to deal with you, and then I'm going to scoot. And they can knock you down. They may swat you, they may charge you, bite you, and then run off because they feel threatened. So you always make noise so the bear knows that you're coming, so it can decide on its own if it's going to just leave the area. Jake has a funny story. He was fishing at Sockeye Creek, and he said he kept hearing bear bells jingle, 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 and he thought, well, somebody's approaching. And then he heard jingle, 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 and then jingle, 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 steady and long, and he thought, what the heck is going on? So he stops his fishing, and he climbs up out of the rock cleft and looks up on top, and there are people standing on top about 20 feet away from a brown bear, and they're shaking the bear bells at the bear. It doesn't work that way. The bear bells just let the bear know that there's people around, and the bear already knew that. The bear was just looking for some fish. So hunting in bear country it's a different experience. I grew up hunting white-tailed deer in the Midwest, and for the most part, I was the biggest, baddest predator out in the woods. I was alert, but it was alert for deer, waiting for a deer to walk by, and a lot of my hunting in the Midwest was simply sitting in one spot, hoping that a deer would cross your path. In Alaska, it's a little bit different. When we hunt deer, we do more still hunting, walking very quietly through the woods, stopping every 100 feet or so, standing there for 5 or 10 minutes, very quietly looking for deer around you. That's the way bears hunt too. So when I got to Alaska, I talked to Joe, and Joe was an acquaintance of mine, and I talked to him about hunting deer, and he related one of his deer hunting experiences. Admiralty Island is a popular place for deer hunters, but it also has one of the highest densities of brown bears in the world. 1 brown bear per square mile. And over the years, brown bears have learned that when they hear a rifle shot in August, September, October, November, there is probably a dead deer over there where the rifle shot came from. So the sound of gunfire does not alarm the bears and send them scurrying into cover. The sound of gunfire piques their interest, and they will start moving off in that direction. In fact, I talked to a researcher once who had radio collared some bears, and he said that bear would come to the island in a place where people landed their boat to go hunting. They would beach their boat, and they would go up into the woods, and that bear would follow them. That is an eerie feeling. But Joe, on this day, I think he was hunting in September. He and his friends had beached their boat on Admiralty, and they all fanned out, and Joe decided he was going to hunt above the tree line, go up about 2,000 feet, 2,500 feet, get up above the tree line and hunt the alpine, because that's where there's a lot of lush grasses. Deer like to feed up there. Well, Joe was lucky enough to get a buck, And he took care of it, and he started dragging it down the mountain back to where the boat was parked, where he was going to meet up with his friends. And he was dragging the deer, and of course he was being pretty alert, but he was leaving a scent trail behind him, dragging this deer on the ground. He was coming across a muskeg, which is an open, boggy, wet area. When he heard a noise behind him, he turned around and looked, and he said there was a bear running at him as fast as it could. And bears will move 30 to 35 miles an hour. It was only a couple hundred feet away. Before Joe had a chance to do anything, a bear was on him. Joe said his last thought before that bear hit him was, you know, I've heard that bears that prey on people are old and scarred up. They got broken yellow teeth. This bear had the healthiest teeth he had ever seen. It knocked him down. It started biting on him, and Joe covers up. He put his hands and his arms behind his neck and covered his head, the most vulnerable parts of his body, and he curled up into a fetal position to protect his abdomen so the bear couldn't get his claws into his abdomen. Well, the bear bit him a little bit, and then it let him go because the bear wasn't interested in Joe as food. Joe was a competitor for the deer that he was dragging. The bear went for the deer, hauled the deer off, and Joe laid there, he thinks, for maybe a half hour. And he's in a little bit of pain. Now, he had to get to his pack. The bear had ripped off his pack, and it was laying about 10 feet away. He had a marine radio in there. He had no cell phones at that time, back in the 1980s. So there was a marine radio so he could contact his friends who were probably waiting for him down on the beach. That what had happened and he was going to be late and maybe he needed some help. Well, he started to crawl over to his pack. The bear was not very far away. It saw him moving, came back at him, bit him again, and then it stood on him for 5 minutes. And it's 600 pounds of brown bear standing on you, forcing the breath out of you, forcing you deeper into this sphagnum moss. Joe was having a tough time. Eventually the bear went away, and this time Joe laid there for, he thinks it might have been 45 minutes or an hour. And finally, he knew he had lost some blood. He knew he had to have help. And he had to get help before it got dark. Made the move for the pack. The bear apparently was gone. Got his radio, called his friends, who immediately called Juneau to call for a medevac flight. And they sent a helicopter for Joe, picked him up out of the muskeg, flew him directly to the hospital. And that was Joe's bear story. I know Joe is fine. Joe recovered nicely. He doesn't hunt deer at that time of year anymore in Admiralty. And what I learned was that I don't hunt deer on Admiralty at that time of year either. I wait until November. And by November, the bears have gone up to the base of the mountains. The brown bears have gone up to the base of the mountains to hibernate for the winter. But still, there are always exceptions to the rule. There are always bears that decide, I'm not sleepy, I'm going to walk around for a while. And whenever I see a bear track in the snow, and even if I don't see bear tracks in the snow, when I'm hunting in that territory, I'm always looking over my shoulder to see if there's somebody that's hunting me. It is hunting in a place that makes me more alert and aware of my surroundings than any other kind of hunting that I've ever done. So I have been in many corners of the state, and I ran across this photograph at the fast ferry terminal in Muskegon, Michigan, and I don't know why it was there, but you can see the state of Alaska superimposed on the conterminous lower 48 states. And you can see down here, we are right here somewhere in central to northern Florida. We'll be hitting Alaska waters sometime later this evening or tonight. And I've hunted this area, which would be through much of Georgia and southeast Alaska. Well, I've also been hunting up in northeast Alaska, which would be northeast Wisconsin and upper Michigan in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I've hunted the Noatak National Park and Preserve in western Alaska, which would be in eastern South Dakota. And I have even been hunting caribou out on Adak Island out here in the Aleutians, which in Southern California. It's just an incredibly huge state, and most of my moose hunting would be done just about where Iowa is. So it's a huge state, so many different kinds of habitats. This is a photograph of the interior in September. Folks have described the interior Alaska as a desert because it gets very little rainfall. I looked up, I did some research, I Googled. The rainfall in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the rainfall in Fairbanks, Alaska. And Santa Fe gets 15 inches of rainfall precipitation a year. Fairbanks gets 11 inches. So it's really kind of a desert out there. So how do you account for stuff like this? A lot of the interior of Alaska is low and wet. Well, there are a couple of things going on. One, there's a clay underlying much of this area that keeps the water tables perched. The glaciers that are melting in the mountains surrounding the area drain into this area. And there's also permafrost, which in the interior permafrost is impermeable to water, so that makes for an elevated water table as well. This is from the Aleutians. The Aleutians are pretty much treeless. And this is from Adak Island. That is the town of Adak, which was a naval air station for much of the latter part of World War II up through the 1990s. There are, several generations of housing on that island, or in town. Then the town was probably 8,000 to 10,000 people at one time. But it closed in 1994 for financial reasons. We had to reduce our budgets. So the Navy moved out, and there are only about 100 folks left in Adak. Some of the things that keep them going is tourism. Believe it or not, tourism, because I think the Native Corporation took over some of the housing, and they've sold some of the housing units. They'll rent out other units. People go bird watching out in the Aleutians because they can see bird species there that you won't see anywhere in the lower 48 or mainland Alaska. It's a wonderful place to watch for sea otters. To the north of Adak is the Bering Sea, where the Deadliest Catch is filmed. So there's a crab fishery out there. There's a crab processing plant on Adak Island. So these folks are making a go of it. And that is another shot. I think this is the Bay of 1,000 Islands, looking toward Japan. It's a beautiful country, although it is windy there. I don't think the wind ever drops below 30 miles an hour. Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This is looking north. These are the foothills of the Brooks Range. This is in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where caribou and Dall sheep are some of the main mammals found there. Noatak National Park and Preserve, that's a herd of caribou crossing the Agashashok River. It's a beautiful country above the Arctic Circle. And a lot of these places are accessible only by small wheeled planes that land on gravel bars. So I was hunting caribou for a week with some friends. It had rained during the week, and when it was time to come out, the river was rising, and the gravel bar that we were using as a landing strip was slowly being inundated. I was one of the last people out, and by that time, the gravel bar was so short, the pilot had to land wheels down in the water before he got to the dry gravel bar, which I thought made for a nice photograph. So here's the part of the talk where I talk numbers. You know, oh boy, numbers. There was a study done. Rural Alaskans eat on an average 375 pounds of wild foods per year. That's about a pound a day. That's about 2,000 calories. Now, when I talk rural Alaskans, I don't mean people that live in the capital of Juneau or in the city of Anchorage or in Fairbanks, but these are people that live in the villages of 50 people to 100 people to 300 people or 500 or 800 people that are off the main road systems. These folks depend greatly on wild foods. Of the 375 pounds, most of that is fish. And here's a couple of folks with coho salmon. Here are sockeye salmon being flayed and processed. Those are the ones that we caught when I was fishing with Jake. 20% of that 375 pounds is land mammals. Moose is an important aspect of that. And one year I was lucky enough to get a moose, had it processed in Fairbanks, and then we drove back home. We had a freezer in the back end of the truck with a generator, so we kept the stuff frozen. And when I got home, we sorted it all out and divided it up, and I realized that we ended up with moose roast, moose steak, and something called lion steak. And I thought, oh no, we had to cross the Canadian border twice. And I thought, if they saw a package labeled lion steak, we would be in trouble, because I know there's some international law that says you cannot have lion steaks. But I realized that our butcher was probably better at living off the land than he was winning spelling bees as a school kid. What he meant was loin steak. Doll sheep are an important part of that subsistence environment. Doll sheep, especially in the foothills, in the Brooks Range and the Alaska Range, are very important to folks living off the land. And of course, caribou, the different herds can number in the hundreds of thousands. And when they migrate, it's an impressive sight. And of course, moose. You may run across in your travels, you may run across pickup trucks with bumper stickers that say, "Eat more moose, 10,000 wolves can't be wrong." So moose, you probably won't see moose in southeast Alaska. There are moose, but at none of the stops that you'll be on, other than Juneau, and I think there are moose that are probably 50 or 70 miles north. You don't see too many moose in southeast Alaska. There's a cow and a calf that I took photographs of while I was hunting. Mountain goats are another important aspect of folks who live off the land, not only for the meat but for the wool. There's a raven's tail weaving that is specific to tribes in the Pacific Northwest, and the best of that raven's tail weaving is made from goat hair. People will go up into the places where the goats spend the winter, and they'll pluck the hair off the bushes and the shrubs and the trees where the goats have started shedding it. They'll take that wool and spin it and create garments. Marine mammals, 14% of that 375 pounds per person is in marine mammals. Seals of all kinds, whales in the north coast and northwest coast. Some of the villages are allowed to take whales. I think I've seen figures that said these villages are allowed up to 60, a total of 60 whale strikes per year, which means they probably harvest about 50 whales that are very important for those villages on the northwest coast. I've eaten seal before. It's what you would have to call a developed taste. But shellfish, 2%. Clams, red king crabs. My daughter and son-in-law and friends holding, I don't know how many hundreds of dollars worth of king crab legs there. Dungeness crabs, those are probably a little easier caught in shallower water, and they're absolutely terrific in cooked fresh. And shrimp, prawns, a basket of spot prawns here. And then birds, 2%. I was hunting moose, sitting quietly, waiting for a moose to come by one day, when all of a sudden there was a crash in the tree behind me, and it sounded exactly like a bull moose crashing through the brush at me from behind. So I whirled around. I didn't see any moose, but I noticed this well-camouflaged bird in the tree behind me, and it was a spruce grouse. Spruce grouse aren't necessarily all that graceful when they're landing in trees. They're not, I don't want to say they're dumb birds, because no wild animal is dumb. They are not very wary. They're kind of naive. And I was surrounded by spruce grouse for much of my day hunting moose this one day, and I got some absolutely terrific photographs and videos. And this male spruce grouse decided that he didn't like me and he wanted to intimidate me, so he spent a couple of hours strutting around me and displaying, just to show me how big and how mean he was, and that trying to convince me that I need to leave. But spruce grouse are an important part of the diet of rural Alaskans in some places, along with ptarmigan. It's ptarmigan with a T, ptarmigan. And trivia contest, if they ask you what the state bird is, it's the willow ptarmigan. Oh, the other trivia aspect, the largest member of the deer family is the moose. And then plants, 2%. Alaska is a berry kingdom. When I moved here, there are berries that I had never even heard of before that grow in Alaska. And then the berries that I was familiar with, like the blueberries, there are blueberries that grow at sea level. There are blueberries that grow in the woods halfway up the mountain. There are blueberries that grow up above the tree line that all ripen at different times of the year, so you can pick blueberries almost all summer long. There's blueberries and bog cranberries and lingonberries and salmon berries, red huckleberries. Lingonberries are like a little cranberry. I think they call them low bush cranberries, and they make a wonderful jam. Yellow salmon berries or red salmon berries, and then red huckleberries all go into making just delightfully tasty jams. So along the lines of this living off the land being a matter of tradition, culture, and family, I do have a story that begins in 1973 when I was a junior in college. And by the way, I can't believe that in 1973, I knew everything. Man, that was, God, that was a great time to be alive. But I took a summer job with the U.S. Forest Service some 200 miles away from home, the first time I'd ever been on my own before. And I was going to save money because the Forest Service didn't pay all that much. I was going to spend my summer in a tent in a Forest Service campground. And so that was the plan. But the best thing is when I got there, there were two young women from the same college I went to doing the same thing. They were sharing a tent in the same campground, both working for the Forest Service for the summer. Well, that was terrific. And over the course of the summer, Kathy and Lori and I got to be good friends. And in all honesty, I developed some serious, a serious affection for Kathy. Oh gosh, she was a tall, dark-haired beauty. Not that she was ever going to know how I felt, because I was terribly shy and a socially awkward young man at that time. So during the summer, later in the summer, Kathy's parents came up to visit her, drove 6 hours to the campground, and Kathy introduced me to her parents, Bill and Marge. And Bill was an impressive figure of a man. He stood 6'4". He was a pipe fitter by trade, and it was apparent that he'd worked hard his whole life. Kathy's mother, Marge, on the other hand, stood only 5'6", but she was no less imposing. She'd grown up in Pennsylvania coal country. And Bill stood on one side of me, Marge stood on the other when they learned who I was, and they started firing questions at me. Yeah, what's your dad do for a living? Is your mother work or is she at home? What kind of truck does he drive, Ford or Chevy? When are you going to graduate? What kind of a job can you get with a degree in biology? Oh man, this went on for minutes. I mean, I was left back and forth, back and forth. I'd blurt out an answer, then the other one would fire a question at me. And after they went home, I told Kathy, I said, your parents really put me through an interrogation. And she laughed. She said, oh, it could have been a lot worse. Well, how could it have been worse? I didn't tell them that you were my boyfriend. Oh, man. You know, I had a girlfriend. If you've ever been a young man, you might remember a time when having a girlfriend might have been the most important thing in the world. Well, luckily for me, Kathy and I were married 2 years later, and I got a permanent job with the Forest Service right there in that town that we had met in. And Bill and Marge would come up to visit their daughter. And I'll be honest, I never knew how or even if I fit in with that family. Even after the grandchildren were born. I felt like the stranger who had stolen Bill and Marge's oldest daughter. Well, eventually my job took me and Kathy and the kids to northern Minnesota on the Chippewa National Forest in the town of Walker on the shores of beautiful Leech Lake. Bill and Marge came up to visit Kathy and the grandkids. And on that first trip, Marge says to me, I see you've got a new boat in the driveway. What do you do with that? Oh, Marge, yeah. 14-foot Lund, solid aluminum, 25-horse Johnson motor. The walleye fishing here is terrific. It's wonderful. And she looked at me and she said, well, walleyes might be my favorite fish for catching and eating. Let's go fishing. So the very next morning, Marge and I went out fishing for walleyes, and we did really well. Came in, cleaned them, cooked them up. That was terrific. Went out the next morning, did good. Came back, cleaned them, cooked them up. Wow, this was really great. The third morning out, before we start fishing, Marge gives me one of those long, apprising looks. And she said, before she passed away, my sister Ann and I used to fish together all the time in Montana. And we used to have this running bet. 25 cents for the first fish, 25 cents for the biggest fish, 25 cents for the most fish. Would you be interested in taking me up on that bet? Well, here was a chance for me to win 75 cents from my mother-in-law every time I took her out fishing. So I said, you bet, Marge. And within minutes, Marge, I got the first fish. She looked at it and she says, that's a perch. We're fishing for walleyes. Perch don't count. Whoa, Marge, I got the first walleye. And she says, that's only 8 inches long. We don't keep them that small. That doesn't count. Apparently there's some rules to this betting game with which I was not entirely familiar. Well, I never realized exactly how competitive Marge was, but one day we're out on Leech Lake and we were doing well. It was mid-morning and she had 6 walleyes. I had 3. She had her limit. And she started squirming on her boat seat and kind of fidgeting around. And eventually she says, I saw a restroom up the boat landing. We got to go in now. Oh, no, the fish are biting. We got to go in now. Oh, okay. So we pull up the fishing rods, and luckily the boat landing is only 5 minutes away, and I pull into the little dock, and before the boat even touches the little dock, Marge is up out of the bow of that boat like a cat onto the dock and making a beeline for that restroom up there in the parking lot. I'd never seen her move that fast before. The boat is still rocking, and I grab the dock, and I'm starting to tie up, and I look up there in the parking lot, and Marge is stopped in the middle of the parking lot talking to some stranger. And then she hurries on up to the restroom. So I finish tying up the boat, and meanwhile this stranger comes down, saunters out onto the dock, and he looks down at me, and he says, word on the street is that your mother-in-law outfished you this morning. She was competitive. So eventually, my job with the Forest Service took me and Kathy and the kids to Ketchikan, Alaska, the place that we're going to stop tomorrow. And the first visit Marge and Bill did, Marge said, I hear the fishing is pretty good in Alaska. What's running now? Oh, Marge, I said the king salmon are in. I mean, they run 20, 25 pounds, and oh man, you can bake them, you can broil them, you can grill them, and smoked king salmon might be the best fish you've ever eaten. And she said, let's go fishing. So the very next morning, Marge and I went out fishing for king salmon. Now, fishing for king salmon isn't like fishing for walleyes where you bring in 6, 7 a day. No. King salmon, it takes an average of 35 hours of fishing to catch one king salmon. So my hopes weren't very high. And after the first hour, we had not have a bite, trolling back and forth out on the ocean, trolling back and forth and nothing. After 2 hours, I was out of coffee. After 3 hours, we had pretty much run out of topics of conversation. After 4 hours, I was just about out of patience, and I'm about to tell Marge, maybe we just ought to call it a day, go and eat lunch, give it a try tomorrow. But before I could get those words out of my mouth, Marge's fishing rod bent over double, and line starts screaming off the reel. Marge, you got a fish, set the hook. So Marge grabbed up her fishing rod and she gave it a tug, and that fish felt those hooks and it took off like a rocket, just pulling out line. And Marge is reeling this level wind reel, trying to reel this fish in while it's taking out line. No, Marge, you got to put your finger, you got to put your thumb on the reel and slow that fish down and stop it. And then you pull them back toward you, and then you reel the rod tip down. You pull them back toward you, and you reel the rod tip down. So she started doing that. The fish would take out 15 feet of line, and Marge would bring it in 20 feet. And then the fish would run 20 feet, and Marge would bring it in 10 feet, back and forth and back and forth. Oh man, this went on for like 20 minutes, and finally she got that fish to within about 10 feet of the boat, and it saw us, and it took off on a run. Marge couldn't stop. 50 feet, 75 feet, 100 feet that fish went, and then the line went slack, and Marge, she looked at her fishing rod, and she looked at me, and she said, it's gone. Well, I looked out in the general vicinity of the last known location of that fish, and it looked like a scene from Jaws with a dorsal fin sticking out of the water and a wave in front of its nose. And I said, no, he's not, Marge, he's heading for the boat. You got to reel as fast as you can. So she reeled up all the slack, and finally she got that fish back on, and she was fighting it, and it went down deep, 100 feet of water, and she was pulling it up off the bottom, and pulling and reeling. And finally, she got that fish to within about 6 feet of the boat. It was laying on its side, its gills just fanning. It was out of breath, and I could see there was only one hook stuck just barely in the corner of its mouth, and I knew if that fish made another run, it would be gone. Marge, you gotta pull that fish in a little bit closer so I can get the net on him, and hold your rod up. But she was so tired she couldn't lift her rod above her waist. And I thought, what'll I do? It's the fish is out there. I thought, well, maybe I could grab the line, but one of the things I'd learned about fishing with Marge over the years was you do not touch her fishing line. So I did the next best thing I could. I hooked my heels under my boat seat, and I grabbed the landing net by the very end, and I lunged out over the gunnels, landed on my ribs. Oh, did that hurt? But I got the net under that fish, and then I pulled it in toward the boat, and I reached over the side, and I gathered that net over top of that fish so it couldn't flop out, and I heaved it up out of the water, and I dropped it on the floorboards between us, and we stood there staring at 37 pounds of ice-cold, wild, quivering Alaska king salmon. Well, I stepped over the fish because I'm going to give her the fishing guide handshake. You know, the nice fish, good job. Well, she set down her fishing rod, and she put a hand on each of my shoulders, stood on her tippy toes, and she gave me a kiss right on the lips. I was in with that family. So that fish pretty much sealed the relationship between me and my mother-in-law. Every opportunity we had, we went out fishing. Fishing for king salmon, coho salmon, halibut. We'd set crab pots. We'd watch whales feeding over here and watch brown bears and their cubs feeding on the shoreline of Admiralty Island. And that continued until Bill got sick one year and our fishing adventures came to an end. When Bill passed away a couple of years later, Marge decided she was going to come back to Alaska, and we took up fishing the same as where we'd left off. Cohos, kings, crab pots, the whole business. When Marge's hips got too bad and she couldn't walk down the long ramp down to the boat, we rented a wheelchair, and I'd wheel her down to the boat in the morning, wheel her up to the parking lot at the end of the day. And we must have been quite a sight out there in our favorite fishing spots with the wheelchair lashed to the top of the boat. Marge passed away 10 years ago. Finally, she became too frail to travel, and our fishing adventures did come to an end. And she did pass away about 10 years ago. And for the life of me, I can't remember the last king salmon she ever caught, but I'll never forget her first. So, living off the land, it's tradition, it's culture, and it's family. This is my granddaughter out reeling up something from the bottom of the ocean. Don't know what it was, but that's part of the mystery. So it's tradition, culture, and family. And when you see me on deck, see me in the passageways, see me in the dining room, stop and ask me questions about Alaska. I love talking about Alaska. You folks have been a great audience. Thanks for coming this morning. I'm back on at 1 o'clock at the Buena Vista Theater to talk about glaciers. So hope to see you there. Thanks for coming.